Hi everyone, this is Hannah, and my discussion video this week will be reviewing hypoxemia and negative feedback. As we learned way back in Chapter 1, negative feedback occurs when the body senses a change and activates mechanisms that negate or reverse it to restabilize. The purpose of negative feedback is to maintain homeostasis in the body. Hypoxemia is a state of oxygen deficiency in the blood. Therefore, the body being in a state of hypoxemia would result in a negative feedback loop to get the body back to homeostasis. Before we get further into the details of this specific relationship, there's some important background knowledge to go over. First, let's talk about blood as a whole. Blood is a liquid connective tissue composed of cells and an extracellular matrix. The matrix is the blood plasma, which constitutes about a little over half of the blood volume. Suspended in the plasma are formed elements. Formed elements are cells and cell fragments, including platelets, red blood cells or erythrocytes, and 5 different kinds of white blood cells or leukocytes. Blood is produced via a process called hemopoiesis, where hemo means blood and poiesis means formation. During fetal development, hemopoietic tissues produce primitive stem cells that migrate into the embryo proper and colonize the bone marrow, liver, spleen, and thymus. The liver stops producing blood cells around the time of birth, and the spleen stops producing them soon after. From infancy onward, the red bone marrow produces all of the different types of formed elements from a common type of hemopoietic stem cell, or HSC. HSCs multiply to maintain a small but persistent population in the bone marrow, but some go on to become a variety of more specialized cells called colony-forming units, or CFUs, which will then produce one or another class of formed elements. For the purpose of this discussion, we will be focusing on red blood cells, or erythrocytes. Erythrocytes have 2 main functions: delivering oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body, and bringing carbon dioxide back to the lungs to be exhaled. Hemoglobin is the red pigmented protein in a red blood cell's cytoplasm that mainly aids in oxygen transport, but also aids in carbon dioxide transport and the buffering of blood pH. The body's RBC count, or red blood cell count, and hemoglobin concentration are important clinical data in determining the amount of oxygen that the blood can carry. So, how does the body maintain a stable RBC count? Through the use of a negative feedback loop. When a person's RBC count drops, due to hemorrhaging for example, it may result in a state of hypoxemia, where there isn't enough oxygen in the blood for the body to use. In order to bring the body back to homeostasis, the kidneys will increase their output of a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO, which stimulates erythrocyte production in the red bone marrow via a process called erythropoiesis, where erythro is referring to the red blood cells and poiesis means production. Erythropoiesis takes about 3 to 5 days and has 4 major stages. In the first stage, a hemopoietic stem cell, or HSC, becomes an erythrocyte colony forming unit, or ECFU, which has receptors for the EPO hormone secreted by the kidneys. EPO stimulates the ECFU to transform into an erythroblast. Erythroblasts multiply and synthesize hemoglobin. When this task is complete, the nucleus shrivels and is discharged from the cell. The cell is now a reticulocyte, named for a temporary network or a reticulum composed of ribosome clusters or polyribosomes. At this point, the reticulocyte will leave the bone marrow and enter the circulating blood. After a day or 2, the remaining polyribosomes disintegrate and disappear, and the cell is a mature erythrocyte. 3 or 4 days later, the red blood cell count begins to rise and reverses the hypoxemia that started the process, returning the body to homeostasis. It's important to note that while hypoxemia can be a result of blood loss, it has a few other causes as well. One other cause of hypoxemia is a low level of oxygen in the atmosphere. For example, if you were to move from a place of lower elevation to a place of higher elevation, like from Miami to Denver, the lower oxygen level at the high elevation in Denver would produce temporary hypoxemia and stimulate EPO secretion and erythropoiesis. the blood of an adult who lives at a higher elevation would likely have a higher red blood cell count to compensate. Another cause of hypoxemia is an abrupt increase in the body's oxygen consumption. For example, if a typically lethargic or sedentary person decides to start working out, their muscles will consume oxygen more rapidly than they're used to, which results in a state of hypoxemia that stimulates erythropoiesis to keep up with the demand. However, in these three cases, erythropoiesis will restore homeostasis. However, not all hypoxemia can be corrected by increasing the red blood cell count. In emphysema, for example, less lung tissue is available to oxygenate the blood. Raising the blood cell count cannot correct this, but the kidneys and bone marrow have no way of knowing that and will continue the process of erythropoiesis in an attempt to restore homeostasis, which produces a dangerous excess of red blood cells called polycythemia. So just to recap, discussion 5, hypoxemia and negative feedback. Hypoxemia is a state of oxygen deficiency in the blood, and negative feedback is the process that the body takes to return to homeostasis. So you start with homeostasis. Something happens like oxygen deficiency, which leads to hypoxemia, and this will trigger a negative feedback loop that tells the kidneys to increase their EPO secretion, which leads to more erythropoiesis, or production of red blood cells, which will lead to a higher red blood cell count, which increases the amount of oxygen in the body and will return it to homeostasis.